Welcome to CAF SoCal, Southern California Wing. And you can see what we're going to talk about today is the venerable AT-6 SNJ. We also are going to take advantage that both of our airplanes on display here turned 80 years old this year. And we're going to celebrate that and have a little birthday party. And a happy 80th birthday for two airplanes that came off of the North American manufacturing plant in 1943. And here they are today, workhorses as ever. So we're going to celebrate them. So here's what we've got for you today. We're going to talk about the airplane, a little bit of history about this make and model of airplane and its indelible impact on the aviation community, especially the pilots who flew in World War II. We're then going to talk about myself and Mike back here. We're going to talk about the histories of our two display birds and how they came about 80 years later being workhorses sitting on our museum, and one of them going to fly for you a little later today. We then have a handful of us who are going to relay some SNJ stories. So it's an airplane that was superbly designed and built for what it was designed to do. And we're going to have a couple guys relate some stories about good, bad, and indifferent learning points of this incredibly good training aircraft. Then we'll open it up for Q&A. Okay, we've got some displays. Charlie Carr, those are hand-built displays that we have up here. Please take a look. And as I mentioned, we're celebrating two birthdays today. So we've got some birthday cake back here. So for those who like sugar, join us, please. And then when we're done with the presentation, and hopefully a lot of us go back there to have a cake, some others of us are going to pull 2550 out and get it ready to fly for you. So as soon as possible after we're done, we're going to have some ground ops and then some flight operations from one of our birthday girls. These data plates, as they are called, this one is from 290, this one is from 2550. Those data plates are kind of an equivalent of your and my birth certificates. And so you can see up here 290, SNJ5, there's the serial number, and it may be hard to read because they're stamped into metal, that says 3943. March 9th, 1943 was when North American, the Dallas, Texas plant, said this aircraft is done. And here you go, Army, Air Force, or Navy, here's your airplane. And then for 2550, our bird over on your right, SNJ5, T6D, the serial number, and that says 9/12/43. 80 years ago. Let's get going. Let's talk about this wonderful airplane here. Again, March 9th, 1943, 290 behind us, came off the plant and was given to the military services. And our little silver bird over there, 3 days from today, 80 years ago, that airplane came off the plant. So what is it about this airplane, right? One of the most prolific and successful military trainers of all time. So how does it get that kind of label? One, because it did, most importantly, it did what it was designed to do, train people who don't know how to fly airplanes. So it has to be stable, it has to have some complexity to it from a student pilot's perspective to teach them the importance of checklist procedures. What are checklist procedures? Procedures that you go through every phase of flight to make sure the airplane is in the proper configuration. How do you start the engine? How do you raise the landing gear? When do you raise the landing gear? When do you control manifold pressure and RPM settings on your engine? All through the different phases of flight, ground ops, takeoff, climb, cruise, descent, landing, after landing. So many different phases of flight. They all have specific steps that you have to take to make sure the airplane is ready to do what you want it to do in that phase of flight. Okay, so that's how it gets known as one of the great military trainers of all time. Okay, you can kind of tell, single engine, tandem seat, that was common through all of the trainers of the era. Student, mostly in the front, not always, mostly the student in the front, the instructor in the back. The instructor had most everything available to him in the cockpit, but not everything. As an example, you cannot start the engine from the back seat. So there were some things that the person in the front had to do. Okay, cantilever wing. That means it was self-supporting. Look at this. That is not a cantilever wing. It's got help supporting that wing. These do not. So that's the, if you don't already know this, the advances in aeronautical design and engineering just skyrocketed in the interwar period between World War I and World War II and during World War II. Just the advances were astronomical. When you think about aviation in general, less than 70 years from the first flight to man on the moon. Pretty impressive in the aviation sphere. Okay? So it filled the need for the basic combat trainer. We're going to talk later on about that, the whole training program from the late 30s to the mid 40s, i.e. that critical World War II era where the demand for pilots also skyrocketed. Well, we had to have a process, and we'll talk about it. This airplane was at the end of the training. There were primary trainers, basic trainers, and advanced trainers. And this airplane was in the advanced trainer stage. So it was named the Pilot Maker because it was, for most people in all the Allied countries, the last airplane, the most advanced airplane that they would train in. Then they get their wings. Then they go to their combat airplane or their active duty military airplane. So here's where we start. First flight in April of 35, and that is the prototype. Okay, the company had different mnemonics for it. North American 16. You'll see that throughout the slides coming up. It had either an open or an enclosed cockpit. So think about where we are in the mid-30s. You know, what do you normally see flying around? Biplanes, fabric covered, open cockpit, fixed landing gear, fixed pitch propeller. So the propellers have a pitch to it, right? So as they're twirling around, they are pulling the airplane through the air. So that's that curve to the blade of the propeller. But fixed pitch means you can't change that. You just adjust with the throttle the RPM. How fast is this fixed pitch turning around? And that's where you got more power or less power. These airplanes transition to constant speed or variable pitch. So now the pilot can adjust a separate knob to change the RPM, how fast is this propeller spinning, and then the manifold pressure, i.e. the power that changes the pitch of the blade. Spins at the same RPM, but either bites more air or bites less air. Constant speed. Okay, well, this thing first was fixed pitch, fixed landing gear, fabric covered. So a starting point. Okay, then we move on to the 19. It's called the BT-9 by the Army Air Corps. And here's where the Navy and the Army Air Corps started diverging. They called them different things. They had little things or big things different about each airplane, though from the layman, they looked the same. A big step right here. They went on the prototype from the right. It was a radial engine. That's what the R means, 975. And then they went for this subsequent to the Pratt & Whitney and the venerable 1340, which was the first radial engine that Pratt and Whitney built. And then they went subsequently on to build some of the greatest radial engines that the world saw, and really helped us win the war. So hard to see. So here's the Navy, the NJ-1. Here's the BT-9. This guy right here. It's got a different vertical tail than what we'll see later. It had a different design wing. And if you can see, fixed landing gear. So now we're going to advance. North American started modifying, so they improved the number. And they entered this one, this NA-16. The Army Air Corps needed an airplane, sent out a requirement for a basic combat aircraft. And this is late 30s, 1937. So they added a slightly different 1340 to get a little more horsepower. Now they went with retractable gear. They did some changes to the shape of the airplane to try and make it a little more aerodynamic. And now here's where they went to all aluminum. So there's a visible step in this advance of aerodynamic engineering. And hey, it's a combat airplane, so now we need some armament. So you can see on this one, your retractable landing gear, they called that the BC-1, basic combat. It's got rounded wingtips. The Navy, again, needing to have something different, squared off their wingtips as a very visible major difference between the two. Advancing again, now we start calling it the AT-6, Advanced Trainer 6. So the differences, now they had the new wing panels. They kind of went to where the Navy did, squared off. It's hard to see in this photo, but the trailing edge, the back part of the wing, had a little bit of sweep to it. So it sweeps forward ever so gently. Gets the triangular rudder that you see on both of our airplanes here. And this AT-6 is what led to that iconic silhouette of the Texan. Now we're going to continue to advance the design, the NA-77. So now we call it the A and the SNJ-3. So what were the differences? They stayed with that venerable, that 1340, still at 600 pounds. They made it a little bit easier with removable fuel tanks for the mechanics to maintain it. And then the Navy, right? What do you have to do to be a Navy pilot? Land on a carrier. So with the C model, the suffix 3, they had a tail hook on it, right in front of the tail wheel. And another thing the student pilots had to learn to do. If I'm going to land on this carrier, catch that cable, that hook, I need to put that hook down. Moving on to the B model. From the A model, they put what became the standard AT-6 SNJ in it, the AN-1. Now these are all 1340, so they all have 1,340 cubic inches of displacement. But other than that, especially on the back part of the engine case, they all have little differences for the specific airplane that they're going to put this engine in. Well, here now on the B model, they went with the AN-1, A, Army Air Force, and Navy, and that became the standard engine to go in all subsequent AT-6s and SNJs. And those are the engines that are on these two birds right here. They also started adding provisions. Some of them, they could put a gun in the wingtip, in the wing. This airplane, right behind the speaker, has a machine gun in it, right? Obviously, it's not working, but they could put that in there for advanced training, basic gunnery training. They could also put it in the cockpit where the breech of the machine gun is in the cockpit. You can see that little bump right there. That's where the barrel would have come out. There's an indent in the cowling, so the bullets aren't going to hit your cowling, and then it's synchronized through the turning propeller, which was figured out in World War I. They figured out how to shoot machine guns through the propellers with bicycle chains. Okay, now we'll keep going. Now we have the NA-88, North American version 88. The 88's important. We'll see that in some of the construction numbers when you talk about serial numbers, bureau numbers for the Navy. And what's that important? That goes on that data plate, that birth certificate for the airplane. And we'll see 88. Okay, so what did the B model, or what did the C model SNJ-4 have from the previous one? Well, one, this is now early 40s, and we are in full war production. So we, supplies, natural resources, metals, aluminums are in unparalleled demand, and there are priorities. So some of these B models had wooden empennages, the back part. These two airplanes do not. They have aluminum, but you can kind of see right here in the middle of the airplane, if you will, just below the machine gun, that's where the empennage connects to the forward fuselage and the wings. And a lot of these airplanes, when they were built back in the day, had wooden empennages because of lack of materials or higher priorities for the materials. As you can see, the C model was when they first started saying, hey, we need to train these rear gunners. Think about the SBD Dauntless, the TBM Avenger. A lot of the Navy planes had rear gunners. So they put in swiveling seats, rear seats, so they could swivel backwards and put a gunner back there and train the rear gunners how to sit back there. An interesting note, these airplanes, the training airplanes, did not have any kind of mechanical or electrical brake in the firing of the machine gun as you panned it through the vertical tail of your airplane. So you could shoot your tail off, literally. So good training, and leads to the need to have a really good briefing between the pilot and that rear gunner trainer. Okay, now we go to our birds. Both of our birds are AT-6 SNJ-5s, same model. From the C, what they did, pretty minor changes. They went to a 24-volt electrical system instead of the 12-volt. And remember, several slides ago, I said there was always, up until this point, some little difference between the Navy birds and the Army Air Force birds. Well, now they're common. They are from tip to tail the same airplane. And the two airplanes we have here were the first version of that to be the first common airplane. And a great picture from an air show not too long ago. There are our two birthday girls flying in formation. One of the critical aspects of military training is formation flying. You did it in all phases, primary, basic, advanced. You learned how to fly formation. Ugh, who thinks that's ugly? And I fly one of these things, and I think it's ugly. That one didn't, experimenting, right? Hey, let's see what this thing works like with an inline engine instead of the radial. Did not catch on. So now we're just moving forward from the D model, the airplanes we have here. They strengthened the airframe, and they did a little bit of a different canopy on it. Hard to really see in this picture, I'm sorry. They strengthened it, and so they called that the F and the SNJ-6. These days, you just don't see a lot of these F SNJ-6 around. You just don't, and I don't know why. But you see a lot of G models. That's the next slide. You see a lot of these D SNJ-5s around, but you just don't see a lot of these Fs. And then on to the Gs. So a little known myth, if you will, North American did not manufacture any G models. They took older AT-6 SNJs and they just rebuilt them. They upgraded them to current standards or added some increased capability to it, like putting in bigger fuel tanks. They improved cockpit layout. These D models SNJ-5s and all the previous ones, when they came off the plant, they had a free swiveling tail wheel. You could not lock it except with a lever in the cockpit. And you would only do that primarily for takeoff. So the G models and current day in civilian hands, a lot of owners, and I think we have an arriving airplane that's going to be on our ramp, so bear with us. Hey, we're at an airport. Take advantage of being out here. Go see this beauty while it's out here. Shouldn't be here long. But both of these airplanes have steerable tail wheels. In the community, we kind of call it the P51 mod, because the P51 had a steerable tail wheel. Based on what you did with the stick, there's a pin that either pulls out or goes into the tail wheel, and you can control it with the rudder and get some nose wheel steering with your rudders, as opposed to needing to do braking. But all the airplanes prior to the G, SNJ-7, had swiveling tail wheels. They are difficult. If you're used to a steerable tail wheel, having the free swiveling for takeoff and landing is interesting. They also simplified the canopy. Can you see how these airplanes, they have a little brace in the middle of the canopy where these do not? Okay, I alluded to the military training a little bit. We talked about the primary, the basic, and our birds were the advanced trainers. So here are good examples. So biplane, 2 wings, open cockpit, fabric covered, fixed landing gear, fixed pitch propeller. Now they got a little more complex, so bigger, heavier, enclosed cockpit, still has fixed landing gear. Cantilever wings, so there are no struts supporting the wing. That's the BT, the basic. And now we get to the advanced, retractable landing gear, all metal construction, constant speed propeller. So more and more advanced, getting these student pilots ready for the higher performance, more complex airplanes. In our beautiful birds here, the student pilot would get about 200 hours total in all three, and about 75, so pretty evenly broken up, a third in all the airplanes, about 75 hours in this, and that was the transition between the basic training and your frontline airplanes, be it a fighter, be it an airplane like this, a cargo airplane that just landed out here. Bit of a comparison, so pretty much the same 3 airplanes I showed, primary, basic, advanced training. But if you can kind of look up here, the weight almost triples from primary to advanced. The horsepower almost triples. The speed more than doubles. And now here in flaps and retractable landing gear, from none of it to both of them, constant speed props, more complex cockpits, and now in the training over here, see where the primary trainers pretty much don't do any of the more advanced training. They do contact. What is contact training? Take off, fly around, land. Contact, single ship. All of these phases did formation, as I mentioned, and this was, back in the day, still fairly early in the whole aviation thing, an excellent building block approach. Back to our birds, training for combat, and excelled what it's due. Back to one of my first slides. Why do they call this one of the most successful military trainers of all time? Well, it just did what it was designed to do beautifully. Okay? Higher performance, formation, basic gunnery, and it ended up being the perfect bridge between the biplanes and something like a Mustang or a Thunderbolt. And I've been fortunate enough to fly. I have some time in the Mustang, and the Mustang is easier to fly. If you can fly this, you could fly a Mustang or a Thunderbolt or a P-38 or a P-40 or a C-47 out here, right? So here, look at this. So he's doing rear gunner training out there. And yes, his head is above the canopy. So in addition to learning how to do this thing and not shoot his tail off, he's got about 150 miles an hour of wind blast on the back of his head. The LT-6. So now we're kind of past the World War II stage. There are still thousands of these earning their pay. That T-6G, remember, they were rebuilt. They weren't manufactured. They just took the best of the old T-6s, SNJs, and they made them a little better, gave them a little spruce up. That was the T-6G. Well, they modified it with additional armament, and they flew combat sorties in Korea. They did battlefield surveillance, and they did forward air control. So they would go over a target area, they would scout out that target area, they would have rockets that they could shoot to mark the target. Those were white phosphorus rockets. They could fire it at the target, and then they would tell the fighters, hey, you see my smoke? That's the target. Cleared hot. Forward air control. So this venerable bird did more than just training for combat. It actually did combat. Okay, who can tell me what these are? Kurt Kohler, he's thinking back there really hard. Nobody, neither could I. Who has ever heard of an A-27? Okay, so North American built some combat birds. They put a bigger engine in it. They put 5 .30 caliber machine guns on it. This was taken over in the Philippines just before Pearl Harbor, where they got wiped out. But that was a combat bird. All right, so now we're kind of post-Korea even, and now we're more where all these airplanes are starting to work their way out of the service and into the civilian hands. War surplus. So this thing has had a global impact. Again, back to that, why do we call that one of the best trainers ever? Well, the fact that we have 2 of them who are workhorses here right now is a pretty good sign. But it was, you can see, flown by 34 different countries over 25 years. It was retired by us in the 1950s by the U.S., but the South African Air Force kept them in service for different reasons, not primary training, but for other reasons, until 1995. That's a huge stretch of operational service in the military. So the Spanish, Colombians, Royal New Zealand, this is just an example, the Syrians. 2550 over here spent time in the Brazilian Air Force and post-military. So air shows. Formatic, this is the Aero Shell formation team up here. The Condors do memorial flights and flybys extensively over the Southern California area. They used to do a lot of movies. So back in the 60s, there weren't a lot of Zeros flying. So what could be modified to look like a warplane for movies in the 60s and 70s? That's the combination of a BT-13, basic training, and a T-6. Okay, so here's a good example. There's a wonderful air show act called Tora, and those are mostly T-6s modified to look like the Japanese airplanes. And there are still about 350 plus. So I think I see that as a huge factor in how well these airplanes were designed and how valuable they are today for doing just what they were designed to do, formation training. Okay, some factoids. The name Texan came from the first North American plant that built these was in Dallas, Texas. Okay, over 5,000 of all the different models were actually built. We've already seen about 350 flying. Even back in the day, there were provisions for it to have machine guns on it for that basic gunnery training. was known by 4 different names. AT-6 in the Army Air Corps, Army Air Force, advanced trainer. SNJ, the British Commonwealth, the Brits and the Canadians built their own version under license. They called that the Harvard. And then when the Army Air Force became its own service, the United States Air Force, they got rid of the A, and then it was just the T-6. And I've mentioned this. From the South Africans, they had it in their active force until '95. We're going to see some craziness coming up here. It's crazy. SIB, it's crazy. So this really is nuts. Kurt. So this is number 4. You can see he's kind of passing number 3. You know why? He can't pull the power back, or he'd go swimming. Better job. Number 4 does a better job here. This is a little more in line with what the airplane was designed to do. Anyone else think that was nuts? Okay, hey, that's me. That's that airplane over there. So a little bit about the history of that airplane. There's that NA-88. So that was North American's construction number. As I understand it, all of these airplanes were ordered contract-wise by the Army Air Corps and the Army Air Force. And then during manufacture, the Army Air Force and the Navy would get together and say, how many do you need? Well, we need 300 and you need 700. Okay, so let's swap them so that when they came off the plant, they had Army Air Force serial numbers, and those that went to the Navy went to what the Navy called the Bureau of Aeronautics number, BUNO. So both these airplanes were accepted by the Navy. Mike's going to talk about 290. I'm going to talk about 2550. Both earned their cred, military cred, in the Navy, flying for the Navy back in the day. Okay, so our airplane to your right over there came off the Inglewood, California plant in September 1943. You've seen the numbers, we just talked about that. And including government furnished equipment, the aircraft cost about $34,000 in 1943 numbers. Okay, what was GFE? The engine, the machine guns, if they put machine guns in them on the plant. So that kind of stuff was furnished to North American by the government. Okay, it was taken on strength by the Navy in December of '43. And of that contract run of 1,500 AT-6Ds, they were all taken by the Navy as SNJ-5s. It went to Pensacola, where at the time there were numerous 10 to 12 outlying fields all around Pensacola, the main hub, And each field did its own special thing. One was formation, one was instrument flying, one was just basic contact, right? Take off, fly around, and land. Okay, so it spent about 9 years training Navy students. It ended up on the West Coast here, down in San Diego, in 1953, and it remained there. And it was stricken off the records, the Navy records, in 1957, after 13 years of doing its thing for the United States, okay? And in that time, it flew, as you can see, a little over 3,600 total hours in service of our country. Okay, it spent 3 years with the War Assets Administration, so as you can imagine how many airplanes we had that were still flying after World War II, and then after Korea, they were all given to this administration, who was responsible for getting rid of them and selling what they could to a smelter to get to, to melt it down, or to sell it to the civilian community. Well, it was bought in 1960 by those guys in Phoenix, and they worked exporting it to Brazil. So as you can see, July of 60 to 1976, it spent over 15 years down in Brazil in Brazilian Air Force livery, flying for the Brazilian Air Force. Had a couple Brazilian owners, and then in '84 it comes back to the United States, up into the Portland, Oregon. Those who don't know where, I didn't either, where Vancouver, Washington is, it's the Portland, Oregon area. So it came back to them, they rebuilt it, it got its standard airworthiness certificate in July of 1985 at Pearson Field in Vancouver. And then in October 2000, it was purchased by a doctor up in the Las Vegas area, and that's where it has lived ever since, flying, looking like that, in the Las Vegas area. So here's a photo from '86. There, you guys can't read it, I'm sorry, but right there below the canopy it says Pearson Field. It's got the red and white stripes, it's got the D-Day stripes under the wing, and all that we've done to it since is we painted the wingtips red and the cowling red. And there we are. This photo is, a little over 10 years ago at an air show. And I think that's the history of that airplane right there. That's going to go flying here in half an hour. So with that, thanks for listening to me. You'll listen to me a little bit more again. I'm going to introduce Mike Hodson, and he's going to talk about the history of this airplane right here. Mike Hodson.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Once again, great job, Lips. We appreciate your expertise and time. Rob lives in Las Vegas, so he comes down here for these presentations, spends a lot of time and money getting it and giving these wonderful presentations for all you folks. So we appreciate it. Thank you, and glad to help out.
And I buy birthday cakes, too.
Yeah, and sometimes he buys dinner, so that's even better. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our yellow airplane here. Here at the CAF, we have two SNJs. We have number 290, which is this one, the yellow one. In the other hangar, we have Bluebird, which is an SNJ-4. So I'm going to talk about the history of this airplane. Number 290 was originally ordered by the Army Air Corps as 42-84895. That's the serial number, 42 being the contract year, but it was diverted to the U.S. Navy as Bureau number 84865, construction number 88-16676 in 1943. And how they come up with that alphabet soup for the constructor number and serial numbers and all that, you'll have to ask the government about that. So 1957, after the airplane served with the U.S. Navy, it was transferred to Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force as, again, another number. Where it came from, I'm not sure, 6186. So, excuse me, in October of 1977, a couple of gentlemen, Dennis Bune and Warbirds west of Compton, recovered the aircraft from Japan in October, and it was registered as it is registered now as November 89014. The certificate of airworthiness was issued on November 21st, 1977. So we had that airplane. The Brandon O'Brien, a gentleman, purchased the airplane in 1979, and then it was ultimately acquired by the CAF in 1984. The aircraft was formally registered to the American Heritage Flying Museum, which is the organization that owns our airplanes. That was done on 10th of September 1991. So unfortunately, on 2nd of December 1993, the aircraft suffered an accident. It crashed into a riverbed near Santa Paula, California. The pilot was flying at approximately 3,800 feet MSL. Smelled a strong smell of aviation gasoline on the cockpit. He had no time to recover, head back to the airport, or head back to Camarillo or Santa Paula. Wound up, gear up, landing, crashing, whatever you want to say, into the Santa Paula riverbed. Aircraft was substantially damaged. He did what he could do best, which was land in the riverbed, away from people, away from cars, away from schools, away from buildings, et cetera, et cetera. So, fortunately, the pilot was not injured. However, the aircraft was substantially damaged. It was recovered to Camarillo Airport, and the NTSB did an investigation why the engine failed, caused by the failure of a needle valve pin in the aircraft carburetor, which resulted in excessive fuel going to the engine. The engine was flooded, therefore it would no longer run. It quit, and it crashed. The wreckage was subsequently removed to the CAF hangar, where the damage inspection and repairs were commenced. The engine was removed for overhaul. The aircraft was completely restored, all systems, hydraulic, electrical, everything was restored. The new cables, new hoses, new tubing, new hardware, new instruments were overhauled, et cetera, control services were recovered. So, aircraft was repainted, repairs were completed and signed off on 12th of December 1995. On 14th of December 1995, 2 days later, Gary Barber made a successful test flight in the aircraft. 2 days later, followed by his brother Steve with another successful test flight. Soon afterward, November 8, 9014 was flown to Riverside, California for formation training. So it had been deemed to be safe, reliable, suitable for more flying, so it went to Riverside for formation training. So we are pleased to report that 290 has flown regularly ever since, a spotless safety record, and has performed hundreds of paid rides with a myriad of pilots. So one of the things that we need to mention is that you can purchase a ride in number 290 or Bluebird. We offer seats in the back seat of the airplane. You get to fly for 20 minutes or however much you want to pay, or you can go up and fly in a Warbird. It's quite an experience. It's noisy and it vibrates like crazy and it smells terrible and it's wonderful. Just what you want in a vintage airplane ride. So I encourage everybody, if you want more information about that, we can tell you about that. So come up and see us at the front desk. We'd be happy to take you for a tour. So that's it for me for my part of the presentation. Thank you folks for attending. Appreciate it. And back to Rob.
Loud, uncomfortable, and it smells. Perfect thing to spend your money on, right? All right, what we're going to do now is we have a few of us who have flown the airplane and have some stories. Whatever they want to talk about, they're going to talk about. So first up, please welcome Monk. He's going to be our pilot for 2550 here in about 20 minutes now. He's going to share a story about this great airplane. Monk, over to you.
Thank you, Lips, for putting all this together. I know it takes a lot of time to do so, and you do a fantastic job. So really the kudos all go to you. Trouble hearing in the back? Is that for the chronologically challenged folks? Can hear me now? Okay. I'm a fortunate person. I don't have any there I was stories where I was really scared and things like that. And for that, I'm very happy. I'd rather not have any of those stories, but I will tell you what I thought, and what I still think is the challenge of flying this particular airplane. It's not really flying the airplane itself. It's simple, rugged, and reliable, which, you know, is just part of the overall appeal of the airplane and flying it. You have to fly it all the time, also part of the appeal. But given my background, which was primarily jets for a number of decades, it became one of energy management. How do I manage the engine, and how do I manage the energy so I actually don't have one of those accidents off the side of the runway or ground loop or something like that? So for me, it was all about concentrating on where I put the throttle, where I put the mixture control and the prop, and making sure I was doing all the right things in the right order at the right time. And if I don't fly it for a while, I still have to put some conscious thought into that before I go fly and while I'm flying. But that's, again, part of the appeal is doing that. And then probably many in the room are familiar with where probably the biggest challenge of operating the T-6 is, and that is on the ground. I like to say it's really between touchdown speed and taxi speed on that landing roll. And so getting back to the energy management thing that I found as a challenge was, if you just have a little bit of extra miles per hour or knots on the airplane, you're not helping yourself. You're not doing one for mom and the kids or your friends or yourself. You're only going to make a potential problem worse. So it's all about flying the airplane on speed. I mean, in a fully configured for landing configuration, you're really looking at about 63-ish miles per hour as a stall speed. So if you're flying it at 100 to 90 miles an hour down there in final, you still have that extra energy anyway. So making 95 or 105 or 110 miles an hour is only going to set you up potentially for failure after you touch down. So again, that managing the engine itself and doing the managing the airplane's energy to get that thing safely down on the ground and down to taxi speed so I can bring it back to the barn is where I found my challenge, and frankly continue to have that as my primary thing I focus on before I fly it anytime, like I'm going to fly it here in a little bit. I'll be looking at that closely and making sure I get all that right, because the rest of it really is fairly simple and easy to do. So anybody have any questions for me? Okay, well, I'll be here all day.
Thank you, Monk. Kurt Kohler.
I know this is kind of hard to hear, so I'll try to speak up. In 2019, about 4 years ago, I was volunteered to fly the raffle airplane at the Reno Air Show. And the raffle airplane was a plane that flew with the T-6s on the race heats, taking a raffle winner in the back seat so that they could watch the T-6 race from a unique vantage, which actually was better to see the race on the ground than it was from the air, but it was kind of fun to do the ride. And on this particular week that they had the races, the wind was blowing very, very hard. And at the time, I would say I was a moderate T-6 pilot. I had made a lot of bad landings in the airplane, and now with the wind, none of it going down the runway, I was a little concerned about flying the airplane in the raffle. And before each heat, before the airplanes take off in Reno, there's a pilot briefing. We all get together and we talk about what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, so we know what to expect when we go out to fly the airplanes. So at the end of the first briefing, I raised my hand when I was when the pace pilot asked if there were any questions. I said, "Well, are we going to take off with any tailwinds?" And they all said, "No, no, no, no." And then I said, quartering tailwinds are really bad. I want to do that. And the crosswinds are kind of strong. I really don't want to land with crosswinds more than 10 knots. Are we going to do that? Everyone said no. And a couple other things. And they all shook their heads and said they wouldn't do that. And these guys that are racers are very experienced T-6 pilots. And when they're not flying T-6s, most of them are flying ag airplanes and doing crop dusting. These guys are really grizzled, very experienced pilots. So with that reassurance, we went out over the next 5 days to do every one of the things that I said I wouldn't do. I have to tell you that prior to that time, I was very apprehensive about what the capabilities of the T-6 was. And I guess maybe more so, I was more worried about my capabilities in these conditions. And more than not trying to crash in front of 10,000 people, I really didn't want to crash in front of those 6 grizzled pilots. I didn't want that at all. And I'm happy to report that the flights went well and that the airplane was, we were landing in 20, 30 knot winds, and some of that, well, most of it was crosswinds. So we were landing at about 15 knots plus crosswinds, and the airplane did a magnificent job. And just as Pat was saying, it's a matter of management, energy management. If you came in too hot on the landing, you just had too much energy. You had to be at the right speed and land the airplane the right way. And the airplane's a very good airplane. It's a very interesting airplane. It's a good flying airplane, even though it sounds like a truck. It's a very good flying airplane and extremely sensitive on landing. Surprisingly so. Most airplanes get less sensitive as the airspeed slows. This airplane gets more sensitive, and that's why it's so difficult to land. But it did a good job, and I did an okay job and survived. So thanks very much. It's a great airplane.
Thank you very much, Kurt. All right, we're skipping over audience, and we're going to go to Jason. Jason Solms, ladies and gentlemen.
I might have to take this out as we get. So thank you for coming, everybody, and thank you, Rob, for the invitation. Rob asked me the other day, do you have any good T-6 stories? I said, well, one definitely comes to mind. So my background is I learned to fly when I was 16 in an aerobatic airplane. So loops, rolls, spins, hammerheads, the whole gamut. And so my background has always been aerobatic, which leads into a bit of this later. I owned a T-6 for 10 years, and there's a big placard in a civilian-owned T-6. I believe this one I know has it, and they should all have it, that says intentional spins prohibited. So those who don't know what a spin is, it's basically a stall maneuver. The airplane rotates around its vertical axis and goes to the ground, right? It's actually a very safe maneuver. In the military, they did spin the airplanes, but when they made them registered for civilians, the way they're certified, it didn't meet the spin criteria that the FAA required even back in the 40s. So they basically placarded them all, you can't spin them. So I never spun my T-6. I mean, I love my T-6. I did old man aerobatics, but never had any desire to spin it. So years later, I've sold my T-6. I'm currently flying the CF stuff and flying 290 here and Blue, our other T-6. And Steve Barber, one of our fallen members, helped kind of build this entire place. Great human. He comes to me, he says, hey, Jason, we got a test pilot school contract up in Mojave. Would you take 290 up and do some test pilot instruction? I said, well, sure. I've done that in the AN2 before, and I'm kind of familiar with a lot of the test pilot, maneuvers and standards. I said, sure, love to. I said, what's on the agenda? What are the maneuvers? So he gave me a maneuver list, and one of them was spins. I'm like, well, okay, T-6. I read the manual real quick. It says, yeah, spins left, spin right. It's all good. Okay, great. Well, keep in mind, this beautiful yellow airplane behind us has been crashed a few times. I believe someone spoke to it earlier about the engine failing. I think Mike Hodgson did. So it's not exactly the straightest old T-6. It probably wasn't straight when we got it, and it's definitely not straight now. So I'm heading up to Mojave by myself to do this test pilot school contract, and I get over the mountains and said, well, let's give this a shot. Let's spin a T-6 for the first time. If I'm going to teach it, I better have done it. So I do a one-turn spin to the left, and the airplane recovers normally. We're good to go. I do a one-turn spin to the right. Airplane recovers normally. Off we go. We're going to Mojave, right? I land, and I meet the instructors. And the plan was I was going to fly ground school the instructors that evening. The next morning, fly with the 2 instructors, then ground school the 2 students, and then fly with the 2 students. That was the program. So I meet with these 2 instructors, and they're badasses, okay? They make me look like a beginner. Like I just showed up with an airplane for the first day. The one gentleman, this little Canadian guy, He'd flown the 100 series, the F-100, the 102, the 104, the 105, you know. He'd flown F-16s, F-15s, F-4 Phantoms. You name it, he'd flown it. He was one of these guys. He was a no BS guy. So I give him some ground school. The next morning we brief, and he briefs the maneuver package we're going to do. And, you know, these are pretty serious guys, like I said. So he's briefing work areas and minimum altitudes, and you know, he's briefing all these things. I'm taking it all in, and we go through the maneuvers one by one. He gets to the spins, and he goes, all right, we're going to do a 1-turn spin to the left, a 2-turn spin to the left, a 3-turn spin to the left, and then a 1, 2, and a 3 to the right. He says, our beginning altitude is going to be 11,000 feet. I have control until 8,000 feet. At 7,000, between 8,000 and 7,000 feet, you have the controls. At 7,000 feet, we step. And I'm not God's gift to aviation, but I know step means he's going to jump out of the airplane. Okay? I've been sitting on a parachute since I was 16 years old. We fly with them in all these airplanes. So I'm sitting here going, well, I'm have one strapped on, but okay. So, but I've spun it. I spun it yesterday. We're good to go. So we brief the whole thing and fly out. We go through some of the basic maneuver package. We do all our stuff, and we get to the spin series. We climb to 11,000 feet. We do 1 turn left. The airplane recovers just like it had when I flew it up the prior day. We do a 2-turn spin. Same thing. Normal recovery, no problem. 3-turn, same again. Each time climbing back to 11,000 feet. We did a 1 turn to the right, which I had done prior day. And then we did a 2-turn to the right. And let me tell you, this little yellow airplane got wrapped up. It started spinning so incredibly fast, kind of got my attention. The test pilot is putting in the correct controls. I can see in the back what he's doing. I could follow through, but I'm just looking down, let him do it, and I can see what he's doing. He's doing the right thing. And this airplane is spinning and spinning and spinning, and I'm watching the altimeter wind down. And I said to myself, shit, I didn't want to jump out of this thing today. You know, we put on parachutes all the time, but you never want to jump out of an airplane. And I know when this altimeter hits 7,000 feet, this guy is leaving. He's probably ejected out of 20 airplanes already. I don't know what his background is, but I know I'm going to be by myself. And that makes the condition worse for those you know aerodynamics and CG. So if he goes, I'm going to have to go. There's no choice. So this thing's all wound up, and we're spinning down, and as we're getting close to 8,000 feet, where I get to fly the airplane, it was starting to trend. It was starting to slow slightly. And he started to say, your controls. And as we hit 8,000, I said, trending, continue, your airplane. He said, copy. So, and the airplane actually stopped at about probably 7,200 feet, okay? And even then, with it slowing, I don't think he would have left at 7,000, but at least was showing some, like it wanted to recover. And he says, yeah, we're not going to do 3 turns today. I'm like, yeah, got it. We're definitely not doing 3 turns. So anyways, we go back, and I follow the instructor, and the next morning, I flew with the 2 students. I flew with an Israeli F-15 pilot, probably the most amazing pilot I've ever flown with my entire career. This guy, never flown a T-6, never flown a tailwheel airplane, never flown a radial. He flew this airplane like he was born in it. It was really amazing. And then I had the opportunity to fly with the first black South African to go to test pilot school. And he did very well as well. Not nearly as well as Israeli, but he also did very well. And with the South African student, we did a 1-turn. We agreed to do a 1-turn spin to the right only, and not do the 2 and have it develop. Well, the way he entered the maneuver, it made it mimic a 2-turn and wrapped up again and did the same thing. Now I know what's going to come out, so I wasn't that concerned. But we got back, and the little Canadian test pilot dude runs over, and I go, hey, I want to eliminate the right turn spin from the academics. He goes, no problem. I totally got it. So anyways, that's of all my years of flying, it's the only time I actually thought I was out to jump out of an airplane, and it was in this old girl right now. So I'm really happy it worked out, and we've got it to show for you today. And yeah, that's all I got. It's my only good T6 story. So thank you all for coming.
So have you ever landed on a lake? I think not. Okay, great. Thank you to the three gentlemen for some great T6 stories. So Q&A, we're about to wrap this thing up. Yvonne is behind the wing over here with her cake weapons, ready to help dish out some birthday cake. But before we get there, I want to open up the floor. Do we have any questions about the Texan, about any of the pilot stories, about the history of either of our birthday girls here? Yes, sir. Question is, what does it mean when the aircraft is fabric covered? That means it's a fabric, not aluminum. So most of these, all of these, both of these airplanes are aluminum airplanes, so metal, other than the flight control surfaces. Okay, the rudder, the elevators, and the ailerons, which move based on pilot inputs to determine what the airplane's doing. Flight control surfaces, they're fabric, but everything else is aluminum. Whereas that wing over there is fabric. So fabric covered means that there's very little metal on the outside of the airplane. Beautiful. So yeah, up front here, I can see it right on the corner. There's an elevator that is fabric covered, so you can kind of see the construction. The insides are typically metal, sometimes wood, but the covering, the outside of it, is a fabric. Okay, Sean, what else?
You said there's around 350 plus of these still airworthy. So if you can you compare that to any of the later jet trainers that we had after this? Because these are radial World War II, and there's still 350 of them going out there. What would be a comparison to get to work?
Okay, the question is, on a couple of the slides we have, there's about 350 of these airplanes still airworthy, still flying around the world. So how does that compare to more modern military trainers that are jets, and how many of those may be still flying today? It's I don't have a raw answer, but I know this. The militaries, and I'm talking about U.S., I'm not sure about the, other militaries and their governments around the world, have gotten real strict on allowing more modern airplanes to transition into civilian hands because of liability, right? These days you can sue anybody for anything. And you could track a military airplane back to who used to own it. Sorry, a former military airplane. Who used to own it? Who paid for the contract to build it? Well, the government. So that's one of the reasons. Plus, Sean, there's also, not everybody, right? Again, everyone, go see all of our other stuff around here. We have a MiG-17, a real MiG-17. That's a Vietnam War era airplane over here in the hangar. It's a flyable airplane. Jason flies it. He owns it and flies it. But in much reduced form, it's expensive to own a jet. Even though when you're paying for 30 gallons an hour of fuel burn on these things, that's nothing compared to 300 to 500 gallons an hour that a jet might burn. So a roundabout way to try and answer your question, Sean, right? There are some, as an example, one of the first jet trainers that ended up replacing the propeller trainers was what the Air Force called the T-37, side-by-side, twin-engine little jet. Called it the Tweet. There are some in civilian hands that you might see around the air show community, but not a lot of them. And some of that is based on what I talked about. They're expensive to own, they're expensive to maintain. A lot of these even the earlier jet trainers had ejection seats in them to keep those hot so that it's safe. That's a whole nother level of FAA and other controls on you to keep that thing safe. All right, I'll take one more. One more question. Yes, in the back, sir. Question, if I understand it correctly, was how extensive was the use of these airplanes by other countries in World War II? And if I can go back, global. So 34 different countries flew it over 25 different years. So again, that moniker, that nickname of the pilot maker, wasn't just United States pilots, but the Brits, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, almost all the countries in the Allied sphere, except maybe the Russians, right? They had their own trainers, had this airplane to train their student pilots to get their wings and advance into the more advanced, the frontline airplanes, be they fighters or like the cargo planes. Okay, good question though. All right, we're gonna wrap this thing up. Next, early November, we're gonna talk about the utilities, what I call the utilities. Some of the behind the scenes airplane, like this airplane, did coastal patrol. The L-17 Navion did liaison work. And the Air Coupe, which did a lot of test bed work to help advance avionics inside the military. And this is tentative. Please look at the red text. It's tentative, but it's looking better because we're a month closer to this. This is Charlie Plum. He used to be a member. He had an airplane here that we used to fly around. He was a Vietnam prisoner of war. He's now a motivational speaker. It will leave you spellbound to hear him talk. And it is motivational. We're hoping he'll be available on December 9th to come here on a Saturday morning and talk to us. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.